Hello, I've got a new short story for you today, which I'm going to be reading. It's one I wrote just a few weeks ago when I was on holiday in Scotland, and that might have inspired part of the story. If you keep listening to the end, then I'll tell you a bit at the end about what inspired me to write this. It's called The Loneliness of the Survivor, and here goes. The waxing moon shone down on the man as he hobbled across the pebbled beach. His breath misted the air, his chest rising and falling in time with the waves that lapped half-heartedly at the ragged shore. Apart from the sounds of the sea and his laboured breathing, the night was silent. The man pushed his stick in between the rocks and, leaning on it, took another step forward. He bent down to pick up the piece of battered driftwood that had come in on the tide. It was the length of his forearm and almost as thick. He tucked it into the pocket of his long coat with the other twigs he'd found that day. If he continued searching tomorrow, he might find enough to make a small fire, enough to warm his aching fingers for an hour, maybe two. He paused and scratched at his beard. It was getting long again, and he rather feared there were things living in it. He could feel them wriggling around, causing his jaw to spasm and his broken fingernails to scratch at his chin until he drew blood. Or perhaps the creatures only existed in his imagination. He imagined a lot these days. At the far end of the beach, the man turned inland and sat down on a low rock in front of a bank that provided some shelter from the biting wind. He set his stick down and cupped his hands, blowing and rubbing them together until burning replaced the numbness in his fingers. He endured the burning, knowing that it was a sign of life. The day his hands would not burn would be a day to worry. From an inside pocket he pulled out a small packet of broken crackers. He'd found them in an old cottage he'd come across 3 days earlier. It had barely been touched, but there'd been little food in the cupboards. A holiday let, probably, unoccupied the week the world ended. His gnarled fingers fumbled at the thin packet, which finally ripped, spilling part of its contents across the man's legs. Methodically, he picked each crumb up, placing it between his lips, savouring the saltiness. If only he had water to go with it. But he'd drunk the last drop from his bottle yesterday, and hadn't yet come across a stream with water fit to drink. It hadn't rained for weeks, and the land that had once been bog was bone dry. The man jerked his head up, fingers convulsing and crushing the small pieces of cracker into smaller fragments which fell to the rocks below. There was a sound, a noise other than the rasp of his breath and the soothing rhythm of the waves. Music. He shook his head. Now he was going mad. He hadn't heard music since the night before he'd left London for a weekend away in the Scottish Highlands. Tonight's the kind of night had come on the radio, and he grabbed her around the waist and danced her around the table in their 300-square-foot studio apartment, humming the tune together. Sometimes he wondered if she'd survived. It was an idle, daydreaming kind of thought, like a child wondering if fairies existed or if Rudolph really had a red nose. He stuck a grubby finger in his ear and twisted it. It made a satisfying squeaking noise and felt a bit clearer, but the faint sound of music was still there. The man grunted and stood, making his way slowly to the top of the bank. Wind whipped his scraggly hair back from his face as he blinked in the moonlight, dusk having given way to darkness. There was still enough light to see by if he kept to the shoreline away from the trees. Slowly, careful not to slip and twist his other ankle, he made his way along the beach toward the strange sound. The music ebbed and flowed, sometimes swelling so he could almost catch a glimpse of a melody above the drum beat, then fading until he was sure it had slipped away for good. It was an odd mix of lively float tunes and indie rock. At one point he could have sworn he heard an electric guitar. On and on he walked, though the music didn't seem to get louder. His legs were heavy, his fingers numb again with cold, but something kept him stumbling on. Not the music as much as the thought of seeing people again. Of course he had seen people since it had happened, mostly in the first few months. He'd even travelled for a few days with another man who'd claimed to be also heading south to the cities to find his family. But one morning the man had woken to find his new friend gone and the rest of his food with him. Since then, he'd been less trusting, and it had saved his life more than once. There were still good people out there, he believed, but they must also be hiding away from the people who would do whatever it took to survive. There had been times when he felt as if he were a part of a horror story, that the world had shifted to become one which could only exist in the pages of a book. But the people who made the music, they had to be good people, surely. Bad people couldn't possibly make such a beautiful sound. He quickened his pace, tripping over rocks in his haste. What would it be like to see people again, to talk, share stories, maybe even laugh a little? He wondered if his lips could remember how to form words, if his throat could remember the sounds. A flicker out the corner of his eye made him stop. A light coming from the top of the steep wooded cliff that towered above him, a warm orange glow so different from the cool white light of the moon that it could only be one thing: fire. The man clutched his coat around him, the image of the roaring blaze warming his chest. The music was louder now, humming in his veins, calling to him. He recognised the tune, though it took him a while to place it. R.E.M.'s It's the End of the World. A rare smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He found a deep cleft in the rock that led up. By the time he reached the cliff top he was wheezing, but at least life had returned to his fingers. Above him bare trees towered like sentinels guarding his path. The fire had disappeared, but the twang of the electric guitar led him on. Idly he wondered how it was possible for an electric guitar to be here in this wilderness, but the thought passed quickly from his mind. Just as he was beginning to drop, his legs shaking from exhaustion, he crested a small rise and saw the fire before him, set in a small dell ringed by 4 giant beech trees. Shadowy figures were silhouetted against the tree trunks, gyrating in time to the music. The man opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He could almost feel the heat of the flames already, blessed warmth. He stumbled forward, hands outstretched, feeling leaves and seed pods crunch underfoot. Another thought flitted through his mind, reminding him that it was nearly winter, and that few trees had sprouted leaves this year, let alone giants such as these, but the thought slipped away like warm butter on a knife. He was close now, just a few feet from the closest beech tree. The figures were still shadows, and the man blinked, trying to make the shapes coalesce into something more human. The song reached its crescendo, the guitar wailing and the voices rising together for the final words. The man was so focused on the flickering flames that he didn't see the tree root in front of him. It snagged at his foot, causing him to lurch forward and fall into the circle of trees. He landed heavily on the compacted earth and grunted as pain flashed up from his knees. The cool light of the moon filtered down through the bare branches of the trees above. A chill racked his body as he looked up, then around in disbelief. Where was the fire? The band? The people? The 4 beech trees stared back at him, tall and unyielding. The man's fingers curled in the dust, searching for leaves that were not there. But they did find something. He lifted the object up to the moonlight. It was small, triangular, almost like a pebble, but thinner, more pliable. The word came to him: plectrum. In his ears, the last chords of the song faded into silence. I hope you enjoyed that reading of The Loneliness of the Survivor. So this idea actually came to me when I was walking on the small island of Carrera, which is in the Scottish Highlands. And it's a really deserted island. There's only, maybe a handful of people who live there. And this was in the evening, so most of the tourists left for the day. And we were walking through this grove of huge beech trees on a cliff top. And we heard the sound of this music, and it was a band, as if there was a festival going on, or perhaps a band rehearsing or something. But we couldn't see them, and we couldn't work out where it had come from. And we were sure it couldn't be from the island, but the nearest sort of settlement or town, Oban, was quite a few miles away up the coast. And it kind of came through the breeze, and it sounded, a little bit odd and mystical. So we did ask our host, the owner of the place we were staying on the island, whether there was a band or any events on that evening, but he didn't know of anything. And we've never found out who the band were, or what they were playing, or why they were playing it. And from that, I just had this thought about this kind of mystical band playing, and what it would mean to hear that sound if you were perhaps the last person on earth, or one of the fewer people, and you thought you were completely alone. And that's where the story came from. So I hope you enjoyed it, and have a great weekend.